Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to a special treat for me and for all of you. I am here with Melanie Reinhart, who is an astrologer, a writer, and a teacher. And she is, for those of you in the astrology world, you're probably very familiar with her name. For those of you not in the astrology world, Melanie is a classic, world-renowned astrologer. But more than that, Melanie is somebody who I resonate with on levels I can't really even articulate. So it's like just a certain resonance I have with you, Melanie. Just the spirit of you, or the energy of you, the essence of you resonates with me. And so I was so happy when you agreed to be part of this symposium. Again, for reasons I can't even put into words. But thank you so much for being here. And I am really looking forward to this conversation. Yeah, we are going
So
to go ahead.
just thank you so much, Martha, for this opportunity
Mm,
to have a conversation with you. It's wonderful.
yeah, wonderful. So the topic that Melanie and I are going to be discussing is a user's guide to the astrological now, which is a broad topic, but I think is going to have some pretty beautiful reflections from Melanie about, again, those of you familiar with astrology and those of you not familiar with astrology, lots and lots of themes that are very alive in this moment. And before we go there, I just want to read your bio, Melanie, so people can know a little bit about you. So Melanie Reinhart was born in Zimbabwe, and astrology has been central to her life since 1959, when you were 10, correct?
Mm-hmm.
When I first heard that, I thought, that doesn't compute. She can't be 85 or 90 years old. That just doesn't work. But you were 10 in 1959. So
Correct.
she has been offering consultations, writing, and teaching worldwide since 1975. A prize-winning diploma holder of the Faculty of Astrological Studies from 1979. She is now also one of their patrons. Her books include Chiron and the Healing Journey, originally published in 1989 and revised in 2010. And I have a copy here. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Melanie has a special interest in contemplative work, both for healing and learning. So welcome, Melanie. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Martha. It's good to be here.
So in terms of this topic, a user's guide to the astrological now, this symposium, is focused, it's really meant to hold space for healing of our world in many different ways, on many levels, but with gender and the healing of our relationships with gender and sexuality kind of as a entry point, or a microcosm holograph, like a holographic entry point. So there are so many directions I'm sure we could take this conversation, but what comes up for you when you think about the astrological now? What's particularly alive in this moment, as we are in, the moment we're recording this is in early April of 2023, and the symposium will be held in June of 2023. So in this time, what is the astrological now? What really is alive for you?
Right. Just a word about what I mean by the now,
Mhm.
because within astrology, we do work a lot with the cycles of the planets. And that takes us into the realm of time, obviously. And one of the things that interests me deeply is the way in which astrology can function as a kind of a language which provides a kind of a frame for where we are now. So I think it's fair to say that different astrologers will engage with their astrology in different ways according to their own personality and also their background skills and training and so on and so forth. So one can look at the history of the world in great broad sweeps of time, which can be very illuminating. Some of you may know the work of Richard Tarnas in that regard, highly recommended. But I've always been more interested in the personal, subjective experience. And this is not in any way to set that against the broad sweep of history and so on and so forth, but to recognize that at a very deep level, the outer historical and the broad sweep of time is co-reflected, as it were, with what goes on in the individual psyche. And in that sense, we're all a part of everything that goes on in the bigger now. And, you know, in terms of engagement with the world, everybody's different in that regard. And I don't feel that there's a right way that has to be done, because different people have different paths. And we're also all on the same journey in a strange way, different though it might seem. And so the working of how the inner experiences within the individual soul arise in response to or co-emergent with what's going on in the heavens and what are called transits, which simply is an astrological term referring to how the planets are moving at any point in time, and specifically how that might be interfacing with our own personal astrology. And no matter, actually, if we don't even know any details about our personal astrology, because it's like the sea, you know, we're all within the same current or within the same waves when it comes to those energies. And certainly I've found that it can be very enriching and useful and really interesting to have a frame of astrological language in which our individual experience can rest. And so ultimately, this now that came to mind is somewhat elastic. One of the things I really like about astrology is that there are ways of engaging with it where time itself is elastic. It's not only just the clock, you know. The fact that we consider the cycles of the planets is its own particular kind of timing. And then, of course, as we approach the core of our own internal experience, with grace, that can open into a real sense of connection with something eternal or beyond the realm of time. So that the now is both a particular focus in terms of clock time and all that. And astrologically speaking, it's by no means limited to that. So I hope that made sense, Martha. What do you think?
Absolutely, definitely. And I often come back to the reality that in a sense there is no time and there is no space, and it all exists now. So now is,
Exactly.
yeah, I completely agree.
A bit like the title of that new movie that just scooped all the Oscars. Everything happening now and all at once, or something. That's
Oh,
not the correct title, but it's something like that. I haven't seen it, but that sounds like a must see.
I'm sure my teenager knows about it, and I'm clueless.
Yes.
Yeah.
You get the lowdown from your teenager.
Yeah. Wonderful. So pretending that time exists and that we are in 2023,
Right.
what is alive for you in the astrology of this time and space planet Earth 2023?
Right. So here we go. Crash landing in April 2023.
Yeah.
So one of the standouts for me is that last month, two planets changed signs, and one was Saturn. So on the 7th of March, Saturn went into the sign of Pisces, and on the 23rd of March, Pluto entered Aquarius for the first time. Now, what really interested me about that is that back in 2020, on the 12th, I believe it was, 11th or 12th of January 2020, there was a conjunction between Saturn and Pluto.
Yeah.
And that's about 35 years worth of a cycle. The last one happened to be on the 11th of November, 1982. So it's quite a substantial cycle. And with the two planets that seem to get the worst rap of any of the planets. And just to be clear here, that I don't believe that there is such a thing as a negative planet.
Right.
It's entirely what we project on it that gives it the reputation or the hesitation, or, oh no, I got a Saturn transit or a Pluto transit, and so forth. So I'm not whitewashing here, because it's true that both of them in their different ways can signify some pretty heavy going experiences. I mean, just look what we've all been through in the last couple of years or so since that conjunction, and in fact before it, because conjunction doesn't just come out of nowhere and sort of land, you know. Because it's the end of a cycle, we have a period before the conjunction where the old cycle is drawing to an end and the new is being prepared. And often we can't tell the difference anyway, because typically the end of an astrological cycle can be likened to what we call dark of the moon in the regular calendar year. So every month or so, there's a new moon, during which period of time we can no longer see the moon in the night sky. And depending on the exact timing of it, it'll be a couple of days either side of the actual point of the new moon where you can't see the moon at all. And then, oh, miracle, in the western sky, there'll be this beautiful thin silver crescent that briefly shows in the evening sky. That will occur just after, 1 or 2 days after the new moon itself. And the sense of renewal and inspiration that can so easily be felt at those times, really something to look out for. But the dark of the moon stage in a much longer planetary cycle doesn't just last a couple of days. It's at least a couple of years, depending on which planets. So in other words, there's a long and very intense build up or let down sometimes, because it is a period where there's a lot of letting go that is required by our soul for one reason or another. And in tandem with that, that can throw up a lot of resistance, because most people don't let go very easily or gracefully, because we're kind of hotwired to hold on to stuff, especially if it's stuff that we've painstakingly created and set up in our lives and all the rest of it. We don't want to let go, and so we fight. And in that fighting, this created a lot of internal polarization, which can then get very easily projected outwards. And a lot of conflict can result. And sure as eggs, we saw that that's exactly what happened during that period of time. And some of the ripples of all that are still ongoing. So the point about both Saturn and Pluto in different ways is that they very often do signify experiences which at the time can really feel bad. I mean, really challenging. And they are also, both of them, in different ways, the signifier of the kinds of experiences that eventually you will look back on and say, oh my God, how did I ever manage that? And yet you did. So both of them also evoke a deep sense of strength and substance and integrity within the soul. A little quote from Carl Jung comes to mind now. Can't give you chapter and verse on this, but I'm not making it up, I promise. The quote is, free will is the ability to do gladly that which I must. I remember being so struck by that. I actually remembered the quote. Something very powerful about surrendering into what is inevitable. In other words, unavoidable. And those kinds of experiences absolutely initially show us, all of us, where we might be still entirely dominated by what Freud would have called the pain-pleasure principle. In other words, that we're wired to move towards what is pleasant for us and away from what feels painful or unpleasant, which is fair enough. You know, on one level, that's a good survival mechanism. But when it comes to our own spiritual journey, it's mostly our ego patterning that controls our values in that regard. and so we go around in circles with that. But transits of Saturn or Pluto can both very much bring things which definitely don't always feel present or pleasant or even light-hearted, and so forth, but which are phenomenally deepening and can be profoundly healing as well. Really exercise our capacity to trust the process and to really walk the talk, in the sense of we might know many things about the nature of reality, the nature of our lives and our destiny and so forth. But these things are kind of put to the test, so to speak, when Saturn and Pluto are active, and they really, really have been. So because both of them changed their sign in the same month, so March 2023, how it feels to me, and I know I'm not the only one who's feeling this, is that this is the beginning of a period where, suddenly there's enough distance between what we have all been going through for some new and sometimes surprising insights to come forth about the individual meaning of what we've specifically gone through in the last, we'll say 3 or 4 years, actually. And so, in a sense, it's a time that makes me think about composting. So scraping up in a heap all the kind of leaves and bits and grass cuttings and all the rest of it from the garden. And that they've probably been composting there a little while, but the compost may be just about to turn into fresh, new, rich soil that can nourish the plants that will grow in the garden of our life from here on in. So a real opportunity for reflection. Now, in the case of Saturn, it just made one clean entry into Pisces. And I think I'm right in saying that when it leaves Pisces, which is in May of 2025, it makes one clean exit out as well. And it's mixed with Saturn. Sometimes it goes a bit of in and out, and sometimes just one straight exit or entry, you know. With Pluto, there usually is a fair bit of to and fro, with some exceptions, but this one is quite a long to and fro. So Pluto only spends about 6 weeks right now in Aquarius, its new sign. Then it'll go back into Capricorn, not very far back into Capricorn, but then it will re-enter into Aquarius later in the year. I believe it's November. Do you know that date, Martha?
I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay, well, I think it's in November. And then it will do the same thing again next year. And it doesn't make its complete entry into Aquarius until November of next year, 2024. So in terms of this mythical now that I'm referring to, it's a time of a to and fro and a kind of in-between time, which is so interesting in so many ways. Now, this sense of one step forward and two back, one step forward and two back, that might be the dominant feeling. And, you know, the more go get it types amongst us might feel quite a bit of frustration around that. And the advice would be to try not to waste your energy in frustration, but experiment to see how deeply you can trust this to and fro. Think of it like a tide. And that sense applies also nicely to Saturn in Pisces. Pisces is ruled by Jupiter and Neptune, who was the king of the sea. So the sense of the tide going out is as important as the tide coming back in. And so there are ways in which we might need to wait to see what the tide brings in to us in our lives, things that we will be called to do, or things that we may be called to release or renounce or give up. And let the natural flow of the energies kind of guide you rather than thrashing around going against the flow, so to speak. Also remembering that in this to and fro time, this might sound nuts, but you know, we might not be sure what is of the old and what is of the new. Yeah, that does sound a bit nuts, but
That's me.
it's not an unusual experience. So don't worry if you feel a bit perplexed. Well, okay, if it's a transition, well, you know, show me the old and show me the new, and I'll just make haste towards the new. But this is not a linear process.
Right.
It's something much more subtle. And so perhaps that sense of a tidal rhythm might be useful here.
Yeah. And
before we went live, we were having an interesting discussion, weren't we, Martha, about the notion of progressism. Now, the notion of progressism is a very linear way of thinking that's very goal-oriented. And while, of course, that has its place, when it comes to the work of the soul, it's sometimes really not appropriate. And it's a cultural dominance that's developed certainly in the West and pretty much globally, I think. That this is the way to do things. This is how to move forward. This is how you get to be successful. This is how you get what you want. I mean, I could go on, but I think you get the picture. But here, if we're considering the movements of soul and the awakening of our own consciousness, there may be different rhythms that we need to live by for a while. And there is, I think that's a great and noble art, personally. That's what I think. So this could be a time of experimentation based on our own attunement with our own subjective experience. Now, lest that sound like something totally selfish, where we sort of disappear up our own rear ends in the effort to keep the world and everything else out. It so isn't that. Because, you know, in line with the theme of the conference, re-becoming the one, the oneness that we all seek is something that I believe ultimately can't be defined, described, pinned down, achieved, bought, sold, etc., etc. It's a subtle and very tender feeling that underpins or holds all of the manifestations within our life. And I think there is something profoundly soulful about both Saturn and Pluto and their combination. And I think maybe now that we're past the actual conjunction, maybe this is a time when we can get to really feel the results and the consequences of some of what we've been through, which has been monumental. I don't think anyone has escaped the last few years without having some profound and often very uncomfortable, frightening experiences at times. And so in a way, we're kind of slightly in recuperation mode, if you get my drift. And so being very gentle with that and allowing the pacing of the flow of time itself with these transits running through it, so to speak. So I think for me, that's a feature of now. And just to mention a little about Saturn in Pisces as well, there's a kind of paradox built into that placement, because as a planet, Saturn's principle is about what has already been established, structures which are familiar, and that includes the structures of society in which we are held, like it or not, corrupt or not, good or bad, you know. And it also includes the structures that we have labored hard to create in our lives. It also includes the deep internal structures, which we could refer to as the ego, which arose early on in our lives in response to the environment in which we were raised, and also people who influenced us deeply in our childhood. Those formative structures can be set in place later on in life, but in the main, it's the really early ones, even the pre-verbal ones, that have the deepest influence. So with Saturn in Pisces, the good news is that that great oceanic wave, which Pisces represents, tends to erode and loosen and even dissolve things which are solid. Now, from the ego point of view, this feels like an impending death experience, to put it in extreme terms. So what we're being asked to do here is to stretch our tolerance for experiences like feeling a little confused, unsure, uncertain, but kind of edgeless, and just not really knowing. It's like, well, what do I do? Where do I go? Kind of thing. Now, typically, when we have those kind of feelings, there might be like a rescue part of us that wants to leap in and fix it immediately and make sure that we don't go on in this horrible state for too long, okay? And from a Pisces point of view, that's not necessarily the wisest way of proceeding.
Mm.
So this is something you might experiment with. Take it gently. Talk to friends who are fellow pilgrims on this path of awakening, which we all share. And of course, use your journal. But see if you can develop more tolerance for those kinds of fluid states, rather than feeling you have to peg it all down, get it secure, and, you know, bang the lid on and put nails in it just to make sure that you got what you got, you know. See if you can experiment with a more fluid way, and with even a little gesture of trust can go a long way with this. So with Saturn in Pisces, there's very much a kind of a both and with this. So the tango is about how to keep our appropriate life structures up and running enough so that we feel safe enough to be able to let go at the edges and watch the tide and see what's coming in. And also to live in the now, without necessarily having a really detailed structured plan of where we're going to move from A to B, etc., etc. Of course, it can happen with these really strong energies that our hand is forced by circumstances sometimes, and then the inner work becomes one of acceptance and wise management in the middle of change. But if we have the blessing of not having too much impingement, then we can afford to try and experiment and see how those edges feel between solid land and the waves, kind of thing.
And I find it really interesting also the dance that Saturn and Uranus have been doing, especially last year, and then the dance of Pluto going from Capricorn into Aquarius. All of it's like there's these multiple ways in which we're being asked to balance what might be wise in holding on to certain structures and opening to new and dissolving old and all of it at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah. And something we talked about before we started recording is that I definitely, I can feel this in myself, and I certainly hear it other astrologers talking or friends talking, who really want to just let's get rid of the old and move on to the new.
Right.
I understand, and I can feel the wisdom of the cosmos in a sense, which is us, the cosmos, if the cosmos is us, which I feel it is, right, then on a soul level, we, source, the divine, has this wisdom that maybe our more immediate selves forget, that that change isn't linear, and we don't want it to be linear. Actually, it probably wouldn't feel very good if we just immediately shot into instantaneous everything being different. I don't know. And I want to tie that into one more thing, and I would love to hear your thoughts. The other thing I think about when I think about that desire for a linear way of being is the reality that also coming up in July, the nodes are going to be switching into Aries and Libra, with the North Node in Aries, and Chiron is in Aries, and early next year the North Node will be conjunct Chiron and Aries. So I think about the Aries energy and the Mars energy, Mars ruling Aries, and how there's this one way of thinking of Aries and Mars energy that doesn't feel right to me, doesn't feel good, which can be thought of as a more linear way of being, or just shooting an arrow straight and going for it. When what feels better to me is the reality that even the Mars cycle is a cycle, that it comes back, right? So when our energy wants to go off and do the Mars thing or the Aries thing, and maybe do the adventure or do the pioneering, or the, burning the pathway forward for our soul, or whatever it is, then the purpose of it is to come back eventually. So I'm curious if you have a sense. I mean, one of your main specialties, of course, is Chiron, and Chiron is in Aries. And just in general, is there a more healed or healing perspective on what this Aries, Chiron and Aries, Mars energy, how would you sum up like a more helpful way of thinking of all of that?
Well, for the astrologers who are listening, I'll do a little digression here into some astrobabble. So if this is not familiar to you, forgive me and bear with me a minute or two. The 4 cardinal signs, which in the seasonal year mark out the turning points, the equinoxes and the solstices and the changes of the seasons, they all fall into the domicile of Mars. So Mars rules Aries. It's so-called in fall in Cancer. It's in detriment in Libra, and exalted in Capricorn. So I don't need to go into the details of what each one of those means, but suffice it to say that when I first spotted that, I thought, wow, what is this? And I had some random thoughts, which I'll say in a moment. I'm not saying this is the truth of what it means, but where I went with this observation, thought to myself, well, there's something about being here on Earth and what we experience, all of us here on Earth, in terms of the seasons and even, day and night and all of that, in which Mars is always involved. So the yang force and how it engages with life, following that train of thought, I'd almost think, well, this is something about, we're here, all of us, on Earth, to learn about what's the best way to engage with the Mars energy. So actually exactly what you were just asking, Martha. So I can't say at all that I'm done with thinking about that. It was like that a little door opened and I thought, wow, totally wow. So really, in terms of relationships between men and women and all kinds of gender issues, I thought this has to be really important. And sorry to leave you with a cliffhanger there, but that's what occurred to me. There's something about how we engage with the energy of Mars that is really important. And in many ways, sort of collectively and culturally, we haven't done too well with that energy, because it can be, Mars, a force of destruction. And we seem to have favored that side of it without even realizing what we're doing. And so the consciousness and awareness of what our own Mars is up to just feels really, really important at this time, because Chiron, planet very much associated with healing and awakening, is passing through Aries, which is ruled by Mars. Now, there's something about the orbital pattern of Chiron where I find the symbolism really touching. So in May of 2021, so just under 2 years ago, Chiron reached a point in its orbit, which is called the aphelion. That simply means the point in its orbit which is furthest away from the sun. Now, Chiron and the other bodies in that subgroup called centaurs, they have very elliptical orbits. Now, in fact, all planetary orbits are ellipses. Some are almost nearly circular, but they are all actually ellipses. Chiron, the centaurs, very extreme ellipses, and Pluto even more so. So they share that. They share a lot of other things as well. But basically, the relationship between Chiron, the centaurs, and the sun is central to the mythology of Chiron, because when Chiron was born, as he was born half human and half horse, his mother, called Philyra, who was actually a nymph, his father was Kronos or Saturn, and he was conceived when both his parents were in their horse form. Bad pun coming up. They were horsing around. Okay. So Chiron was born a centaur, half human and half horse. When his mother saw him, she was horrified and prayed to the gods to be made into anything other than what she was. In her eyes, the mother of a monster. Okay. And so she abandoned Chiron on the hillside. And in the time-honored manner of myth and legend, Chiron was found by a kind shepherd who took him to the sun god Apollo, from whom he learned a whole range of different skills, including music, medicine, archery, survival skills, and so forth. And we see Chiron as a well-known and well-respected healer, but also mentor of young men. These being pretty much any Greek hero that you know the name of was mentored by Chiron. So he offered his tutelage to young people to find their own individual destiny. That is a theme related to the astrological sun, you see. And so with Chiron's orbit going really quite far out away from the sun, almost into the orbital path of Uranus, but not quite. You might see slightly different versions of this. The astronomy, I mean, you'll see different facts. Don't you love it? We have to call these factoids, fact-like things. Okay.
Mhm.
So it depends actually how the orbits are measured, but basically Chiron goes out into the sphere of the orbit of Uranus, but doesn't cross right over it. Okay. And that's pretty much where it still is now. And then once it's reached the aphelion, in its orbit, it starts to come closer in to the sun, and actually gets closer and closer, and then goes right through the orbital path of Saturn. So for a period of time, it's about 17% of its orbit, I believe. It spends that in between Jupiter and Saturn. Wonderful symbolism, because Saturn is the edge of the visible planets, and beyond that are mostly the invisibles, or the ones that were discovered at least with maths and technology. So the real divide there is between Saturn and Uranus. So it's as if the movement of Chiron is serving to link the visible and the invisible, the realm of the visible planets and the invisible planets, and pretty much any other pair of opposites that you care to land on. There is a sense of weaving or bridging or linking that's part of Chiron's process. Oh, and his wife, Chariklo, very similar, except she does not cut through the orbit of Saturn, but nestles neatly in between them, linking still the orbits of Saturn and Uranus. So what's very cool about all this is the fact that Saturn and Uranus are the two planets which rule the sign of Aquarius, in which Pluto's just moved, into which Pluto has just moved. So this theme of the link between Saturn and Uranus, we could say, is like ongoing now, because these two planets rule Pluto's position until 2024, when it moves into the next sign. So this is turning out to be quite a big now that I'm referring to. But really just the theme of the opposites, and where they touch and where they don't, where they come together or split apart, and how to be with that dance. To me, this is written all over the astrology of now. And Martha, to go back to what you mentioned there about Chiron in Aries will be on the North Node next year. You see, the whole time with Chiron being in Aries, to just refer back to what I said about Mars and the theme of Mars. So Mars is the archetype of the warrior. And so there's so much to think about in terms of what that means and what it is. And, you know, it raises the questions of like, well, actually, what battles are we fighting?
Yeah.
And is it worth it? And what are we trying to win? Are we trying to win? Who's running the show here? Who's my master? What am I serving in the effort that I'm putting in? And so forth. Because, you know, the notion of a holy war, there's several religions in which you will find this. And in some cases, it's been tragically translated into an external war against external enemies. I mean, here we have like history unfolding, for goodness sake. And I think that applying applying battle metaphors to what goes on within the soul, I think personally is rather questionable. There can be endeavor and struggle and so forth, but battle metaphors cause a kind of a splitting where the psychological process of denial, splitting, and projection will almost always result from that. So if something's arising within our soul that for whatever reason we can't accept, because of moral ideas we have, because of conditioning, or because of fear, it doesn't matter what the reason is, but something which is denied will become split off and pushed out, so to speak, and projected onto someone, somewhere, somehow, that then becomes the enemy. That's the principle of scapegoating, and it can operate in very subtle ways, you know. We can even scapegoat parts of our own self by denying, splitting, and projecting them. It even be projected onto parts of our body that we then dislike or endlessly trying to fix, and so forth. So to me, there's a huge, profound, ongoing lesson here with Pluto in the sign ruled by Saturn and Uranus. A big exploration, because of course, the archetype of the warrior is a very important one for all of us in our lives. But it's something about how that energy is managed, and whether we create strife and destruction by the way we manage it, or whether we find another way. One thing I've been very aware of since Chiron went into Aries is that there seems to be a lot more awareness coming into the collective soul now, more conscious in the collective soul about the incredible amount of trauma and damage which is done during the course of war. The whole notion of a just war is something, there's moral conundrums abounding in that phrase and the consideration of it. And you know, in the earlier part of the 20th century, wars were fought from which soldiers returned with terrible injuries and terrible trauma. And you know, there wasn't even the language, let alone the permission, in terms of patriotism and current customs and morals and all the rest of it, to speak about it. And so, not surprising of the high number of returning soldiers who ended up with various life-threatening addictions, alcohol, drugs, violence also, and so forth. So there's a big light of understanding that's being turned towards this now. And I've heard some just incredible, heartwarming stories about even quite elderly former soldiers, you know, from World War II or from Vietnam, because those are quite a long time back now already. It's never too late to open up if the circumstances are right. So there's a heartening depth of understanding coming in more and more about this. And even the degree to which many professions where this was never even thought about, such as being a firefighter, being a policeman, being an emergency nurse or doctor, all carry elements of potentially traumatic experiences that were completely not factored in at all before, and now this is beginning to change. And so, you know, one function of the warrior energy in any of us is to protect those who are vulnerable, those who are very young or very old, or physically frail, and so forth. And that also applies inwardly. It's our own warrior energy that can protect us, hold us back from doing things which are not wise for us and which are not going to have a good outcome. So there's a whole reframing of warrior energy. And then, of course, there's the notion of a spiritual warrior as well, because it does take an enormous amount of persistence and bravery and courage and steadfastness to tread the inner path, which many of us are called to. And so, you know, Chiron was in Aries at the end of World War I. It overlapped with the pandemic, just like now. And then the next time it was in Aries, it was, there were some pivotal events that happened with Chiron in the final degree of Pisces that only came to light when Chiron was in Aries, that began the ending of the Vietnam War. Namely, that was the My Lai massacre. That happened when Chiron was in the last degree of Pisces, and it was not made public until Chiron went into Aries. And, you know, then the level of outcry that occurred with that extraordinary man called Hugh Thompson, who was part of the massacre, except when he saw what was happening, he tried to drive his helicopter in such a way that he was intercepting the troops that were attacking this village. And he spent the rest of his life in various stages of trauma, but never gave up campaigning in humanitarian ways, you know. So that was Chiron into Aries. And now again, well, we've had the pandemic, and we do have a war in Ukraine with Russia, and there are all kinds of international players all dancing around on the chessboard now. It's like, who's going to be the one to knock the king down, or, you know, shoot the knights, or whatever. It's going on apace at the moment. And, you know, each of us is called to engage with that in our own individual way. You know, it's not everybody's fate to be like an ambulance driver on the front line, or to be a journalist or a messenger right there in the thick of it. But by attending to our own Mars energy within and what we're doing with that, we can still be in the same field and contribute in whatever way that we feel called to do to the actual war effort, you know?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking, you know, of also Mars as an energy of aggression. Aggression, of course, can be turned back upon ourselves. That's what's called an autoimmune disease, where our normal healthy defenses in our immune system somehow turn around and they begin attacking us like we're the enemy, instead of keeping us safe by keeping viruses and other kind of stuff out of our bodily integrity. They turn on us. And to me, that's a Mars process as well, where the Mars process somehow got corrupted and turned against us. And I understand that there's a huge amount of autoimmune disease around on the planet at the moment, you know.
One thing that comes up for me as you're talking is I have my South Node, Chiron, and Venus all conjunct in Aries. So not surprisingly, you know, in my younger days, in my college days, and that's in my 8th house. So very intense. So I was born in Thailand and I grew up in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Kenya, and the United
Wow.
States. Yeah. So as a young child, I was surrounded by, not in my personal life, but in my surroundings, especially when I lived in Peshawar, Pakistan,
Oh,
which is,
I know it.
yeah, on the border of Afghanistan, and it was the 80s, so it was the Afghan-Russia war was happening.
Yeah.
There were bombs going off, and like
Wow.
in my front yard there would be bullets just, you know, there with my
Random bullets.
yeah,
Right.
random
Oh my
bullets.
God.
So that South Node Aries thing in my 8th house was definitely alive, I would say, in my childhood, but not so much in my
Absolutely.
personal life. Yeah. But the other thing I witnessed a lot of in the way I grew up was violence against women, of course, given where I was living. And I was
Wow.
very, very close to my nanny, who became later my stepmom, which is another story. But anyway, so I heard all of her horrific stories of being an extremely poor girl in Peshawar, Pakistan. You know, early forced marriage at age 11, and on and on and on. Lots of violence and that kind of thing. So that was in my psyche my whole childhood. And then when I grew up, I went to school to become a social worker. And so I was a clinical social worker, and I specialized in trauma and attachment. And I was a psychotherapist, and I worked in inner city Washington, D.C., and then later moved to California and did work here in the child welfare system for a long time. So again, like that violence thing was very alive for me.
Yeah.
But in my when I was in college, I went back to Pakistan and stayed with my stepmom's family in a village there. Again, very, very poor. And, you know, the gender treatment is horrible. So I came back to school, and I shaved my head, and I decided I hated men and I didn't want to have anything to do with them. And that didn't last very long. But the point being, I went to this extreme version of the warrioress, you know, the like intense
Okay.
rage against this violence, the gender violence. And also I happen to have Eris Xena exactly opposite my Pluto. I think that plays in there. But so I understand that need to be the warrior who's going to fight. And of course, now I'm 46, and I pretty quickly realized, you know, after being 19 and shaving my head, that going to that extreme isn't really the answer. So then I married a man, and I had children, including somebody identified as a boy at birth, you know, right? So I no longer hate men, and recognize that we need to re-become the one, not do the polarized thing.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think it's so interesting now that Pluto will be squaring the nodes precisely when they switch into Aries and Libra, and Pluto will be, I think at that point, retrograde in Capricorn.
Capricorn.
Yeah. So Pluto will be in the middle of its dance between Capricorn and Aquarius as it exactly squares the nodes, as the nodes switch into Aries and Libra. So, I mean, yeah, just we've been talking a long time, so I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I am curious, this whole dance of, again, this natural desire in us to be the warrior or the warrioress, or, you know, whatever it is, it's a good desire. It comes from a place of love. I think ultimately it comes from a desire, at least in me, to protect. I wanted to protect the girls and the women who I love, who I truly do love in Pakistan and in the world. And I wanted to protect myself. But but that's not ultimate healing, right? So I think it's really interesting when you're talking about Chiron and Aries being a way, maybe a way to reconceive of how we are as warriors, because we are warriors, and that's part of what we are. But what's the positive way to be that? Like Pluto squaring the nodes, as you know, as the North Node is dipping into Aries and heading toward Chiron. I just think that's really fascinating on a collective level.
Very much so. And, when any planet is making what's called a T-square with the nodes, it does bring in an element which we might call fated, by which I mean that stuff happens and events occur. And here with events, I mean that can include internal events. So whether it's an inner event or an outer event, or one which is clearly resonating in both directions, it's something life-shaping. So one way of looking at the nodes is it's to do with associations. So that word meant in both senses of the word, like an associate is a person. An association can be with a whole group. And so that the nodal meaning of associations is our associations with people where there's a destiny shaping element to it. And this could be family and ancestry. It could be friends. It could be teachers. It could be past lives, depending on how you frame that. I personally don't like that phrase too much because, again, it's too linear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But certainly there are other dimensions, and we can resonate into other times and other places. There was something I was about to say, then forgot. Oh yes, a very interesting example of this with the nodes is if you dig around a bit with this, you'll probably find that if you have like a totally favorite composer or artist or writer, if you have a look at their horoscopes, chances are that they've got something really significant on your own nodal axis or right near it. And I love that because it takes us again out of the limited now into resonances and other dimensions and so forth. That's a really fun thing. So with your neat observation about this T-square with Pluto in the nodes occurring in the sort of pivot point of the to and fro, meaning the transition of Pluto finally entering Aquarius next year. Now, that could be a really important pivot point, which really helps us to make decisions about where we want to or need to put our energies. So, in other words, circumstances between now and when that happens, it's about a year from now, I believe. And it won't be just a sudden blip, so you won't miss it, trust me. That might be a pivotal time in which we are shown in no uncertain terms what it is that we must do. And in that sense, put our warrior energy towards and move forward, so to speak, with that North Node coming into Aries like that, as it will do. That's how I would see that,
And yeah, and one other thing, just one other thought I'm having about the Chiron component is it feels to me like, again, when we maybe feel polarized or feel like we want to other something else, we want to stay in the polarity and and think I'm right, they're wrong. I'm going to shave my head and never talk to men ever.
Right.
I feel like the Chiron component, again, because, well, okay, it's bridging the Uranus and Saturn orbits. It's bridging the seen and the unseen. It's bridging this world and maybe what else is true for the divine, et cetera, et cetera. But it to me, it feels like it has this element of bringing me back, or bringing us back to our own our own wounding, our own truth, our own need to do the healing. And it brings me back to a humility, like that I can't just declare the way to be and go do that thing.
Yeah,
Because
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Chiron on my south node brings me right back to I'm human, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
And also the way you described that process, I think contains something of a key. And people often associate the very symbol, the visual symbol of Chiron, as a key. But when you said about being right and wrong, that is surely a cue for any of us. The need to have to be right is something so seductive and can be so toxic, because that comes from a mental place, really, and that may be layered on top of some very painful feelings, which, as you were just saying, if we can once connect with that, it takes the energy of a brave warrior sometimes to be able to do that, and that can be part of the journey sometimes. But I know, and I'm sure I'm not the only one on this call who knows this, that the subtle feeling of wanting to be right, wanting to be able to prove it, that I'm right, and this is the kind of I'm right where somebody else has to be wrong, because that's the kind of no-win situation that gets created there. We're all at this a lot of the time. And I think that we have an extended opportunity with Pluto in Aquarius of really observing and watching what's going on with those kind of energies within ourselves. Because, Aquarius, it is the final one of the air signs, right? So all the air signs refer to different levels of mind, of perception, language, communication, which develops into concepts or principles or values. And then we have the collective mind. So there's something very potent about the collective mind and what's happening in the collective mind at the moment. And yet, in my way of thinking, because Aquarius is the final one of the air signs, maybe it's potentially the sign within which we finally get to realize we're never gonna understand it all. And we're never gonna be right in this ultimate way that we kind of seek to or want to be right, It's like the jumping off point into what we might call the clear light of awareness, or something like that has much less to do with the structures that are contained in that space, which we normally think of as our mind, but it's actually just a whole lot of structures in there, and so it's kind of the jumping off point. And rather beautifully, we have Saturn in Pisces, the last sign. We've got Pluto in Aquarius, the second last sign, Saturn in Pisces, the last sign. And so that's almost like the jumping off point at the level of feeling. So it's feeling that's gone beyond, here's a me and there's a you, and I like you or I don't like you, and I want you and you belong to me, or I belong to you, any of those incredible transactional nightmares that at one point or another, most of us get into that and hopefully also out of it. But the level of feeling, the deepest level of Pisces, it is a kind of a jumping off point into a kind of state of oceanic feeling, which is the ground of feelings. It's a paradox. Should have said the ocean of feeling, which can contain the whole myriad of all the different feelings that we might feel, and not necessarily impart to them an undue sense of substance, because it is all a flow, so to speak. So I just find it amazing that where the action is in this astrological now, this mythical now that we keep talking about, or I keep talking about, that is the last two signs of the zodiac, the jumping off point of the mind into a whole other level of the mind, wherein thinking takes place. And so we have a chance, a new vantage point, to actually see what's going on in these minds of ours, where we are then in a position to come back to a certain kind of median clarity, rather than getting beguiled or dragged along by what's going on in our own minds, you know. And very important, because the energy in the collective mind at the moment is very compelling. And that manifests as things like propaganda. I mean, train yourself to spot the propaganda. And that doesn't mean that you then have to go around possibly putting yourself in danger by denouncing it in the wrong way at the wrong time. But certainly step one is to see it. And it's not that you have to prove anything to anybody. You can learn to see what's false. That's really important, I think, at the moment. That includes the falseness within ourselves as well, which can feel very embarrassing, but we just need to be very gentle with that. It's
Right.
not a cause for more negative self-judgment.
Right. Again, that we can't know it all. Inevitably, we will be quote unquote wrong at various points. Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm. Beautiful. Is there anything else you feel called to say?
I think those are the main things for now. I can actually, I can talk endlessly about astrology, and I especially love having astrological conversations like the one I've been having with you. So I'm very grateful for this chance to speak with you.
Well, I could listen to you endlessly, and I have, probably days of questions I could ask. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
What would you like to share with people about your work, your website, anything? If people are intrigued, which I'm guessing many people are, if either they already know you and they're more intrigued, and or they didn't know you and now they're intrigued. So
okay.
yeah.
So my website is just my name, MelanieReinhart.com. And it's a bit of a jungle, my website. There's a lot of stuff you can hopefully enjoy digging around with. There is an events page for things that I'm doing, whether they're live or online. And I do have a subscribers list, which you're welcome to join. It's free, and you can unsubscribe whenever you want. And so I do send occasional newsletters. And I think that's all, really.
Great.
Oh, and my books, you can buy my books from my website, and they're also on Amazon and other major distributors, and in some lucky places that still have bookshops. You might even find them in bookshops. Wow.
Yeah. And among other topics, I mean, certainly there's this Chiron specialty that you have, but just for people's information, and you also work with some other centaurs, including Pholus, Nessus, and Chericlo.
Indeed.
Yeah. I know a lot of people are fascinated, especially by Chericlo, but the others also. And
Yeah. There will also be a new book coming out called Sideways from Saturn. This is an anthology that will be published by Principe Press. And I think there's 12 at the moment, 12 people contributing essays. And the focus is all about the Chiron and the centaurs. So that'll be all a whole lot of new material from people, some of whom you may have heard of and associated with the centaurs already, and others you may not have heard of. So it's a lovely collection. It's forthcoming still at the moment, so it'll be out in due course.
You don't have a release date or anything yet on that?
No, I don't.
I will
But
definitely.
it should be soon, I hope.
Wonderful. I'll definitely be getting that book. That sounds great. Okay. Thank you so much, Melanie.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you. It's been lovely to speak with you.
You too.